Hi everyone! Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Instead of focusing on just one question for the duration of the entire video, I'm going to be answering several questions. Now, as many of you know, I wrote this book, Designing the T-34. It came out late last year, or earlier this year if you live in North America. And this book was published through Morton's Books, and they sent me a couple of questions from their readers, which I am now going to answer in video. So without further ado, let's begin. The first question is actually two questions that I rolled into one. So the questions read, what inspired you to write the book, and what made you decide to focus on the T-34 tank in particular? So the T-34 tank became a legend after the war. When you hear Soviet tank, you imagine the T-34, same as if you hear the word German tank, you imagine a Tiger. If you hear the words American tank, you imagine a Sherman. Naturally, there was a lot written after the war in the English language about the T-34, but unfortunately the sources available to English language authors were not the greatest. They had to rely on memoirs, namely memoirs of German generals who survived the war, as well as other sources that were equally unreliable. And so over the decades following the war, this picture of a T-34 that was formed was quite distorted. But since it was so ingrained in the popular understanding of history, then it just kind of solidified itself as the incumbent, and it's quite difficult to dislodge. Over the past couple of years, as many of you know, I have been translating historical documents from Russian to English to kind of try and combat this ingrained notion. And when I started moving over to printed media rather than just writing online articles, then the T-34 seemed a pretty good place to start. There's definitely plenty of myths that are very popular about it, as I addressed in an earlier video that I did with Military History Visualized, and of course there are many more that are tackled in my book. Was the T-34's design a reaction to foreign developments, a response to combat experience, or a logical evolution of existing Soviet tanks, or a little of all three? I would say that this was an evolution of Soviet tanks in response to the Spanish Civil War. So before the Spanish Civil War, you see mostly attempts to improve the tank's maneuverability, speed, reliability. In around 1936, 1937, all of this starts to change. You start seeing a very pronounced effort to improve the mobility of tanks. The armor protection of tanks. This includes putting the armor at a slope, thickening the armor protection. All of these things were eventually implemented on the T-34. However, these improvements were also made to other tanks, such as the T-26 or its attempted successors, the T-46 and the T-50. So it wasn't exclusively the T-34 and factory number 183 Design Bureau that was responsible for these improvements. There are many design elements in the T-34 that are direct descendants of requirements written as a response to the Spanish Civil War. I also actually talk about this in a video with Military History Visualized. In part, this is a seal of all joints and slits and cracks against Molotov cocktails, which were quite popular weapons during the Spanish Civil War. There was a requirement to have very high gun elevation that it was reduced from 70 degrees to 30 degrees, and this was actually something that the British comment on as well in their analysis of the T-34, that the gun elevation can go up quite high. Another requirement was a rear-facing machine gun, so a machine gun that's stuck out the back of the turret. The T-34 doesn't have that; it does have a pistol port back there, so this requirement was not completely ignored in the tank. Of course, the thick protection against anti-tank cannons that evolved from the Spanish Civil War as well, where it was actually heavy machine guns and 37mm guns that were the biggest enemy of the Soviet T-26 tanks rather than German or Italian tanks. What was the most troublesome aspect of the T-34's design during its development? The engine, the armor, tracks, equipment, or something else? I would say that putting the tank into production, so true mass production, was actually the hardest thing to do. Um, it's easy to make a tank. It's not easy to make 100 tanks or 200 tanks or 300 tanks every month. So there were a lot of things that worked on the A-34 prototype tanks that stopped working really quite that well once they had to be produced in insufficient volumes. A good example of this is the running gear, so the wheels of the tracks. The T-34 prototypes, the two tanks that famously drove from Kharkov to Moscow and back, they would drive for 3,000 kilometers. They had issues, but they'd be fine. Uh, the only thing you had to replace was the engine. When T-34 tanks were starting to be built, the only components that could not be guaranteed to withstand 3,000 kilometers of travel were the tracks and the road wheels. Tracks could only actually withstand about 1,500 kilometers, and the factory agreed to even ship multiple sets of tracks with every tank until this issue could be rectified. The armor was actually in a similar boat. So initially, the way that T-34's armor was designed was that it was initially meant for mass production. So that means it had to have a minimum of expensive alloying elements built into it. It should be able to use byproducts, industrial byproducts, rather than pure nickel or whatever other elements need to be put in there. And so this was actually quite a challenging thing for Scientific Institute 48 to research, but they managed to in the end. There were issues with welding. High hardness, the higher the hardness of the armor, usually the more difficult it is to weld. The thicker the armor, the more difficult it is for weld penetration to be complete. There was a number of hulls and turrets in early 1940 that were actually rejected because of widespread cracking. The result was that NI 48 scientists had to travel to Factory 183 and teach the welders how to weld properly using austenitic electrodes because of these issues. Interestingly enough, the hulls and turrets that were rejected as a result were shot up, and it turned out that having the cracks in the armor didn't radically reduce the robustness of the tank, so the cracks would get wider and longer as the tank was hit with shells, but the resistance of the actual armor did not decrease. Did the T-34's designers have to worry about cost? Presumably, the tank was designed to facilitate mass manufacture. Were any shortcuts taken, and what was the effect of that? Right, so this is a very common misconception people have about the Soviet economy. They think that, well, if they were communists, there's no such thing as money. Everything is free. If Stalin says this tank costs 1,000 rubles, that means it costs 1,000 rubles, and it doesn't mean anything. The Soviet economy did not work like that. Factories workers still needed to be paid. Materials still cost money. This went double for any imported materials, since those are paid for with currency, foreign currency, which was obviously, there was a shortage of it, of course, at all times. So the cost of the tank did have to be driven down as low as possible. The armor that I mentioned before, very good example of that. Another example was tracks. So I mentioned that they had the tracks that only lasted for 1,500 kilometers. They actually had better tracks. So there were tracks that were stamped, that had the track guide horn welded in. Those tracks lasted for much longer. It could actually go for a full 3,000 kilometers. Those tracks were very complicated and time-consuming to produce. So naturally, when instead of producing these hand-assembled prototypes, production went to T-34 tanks, these tracks could no longer be used because they couldn't be made in sufficient amounts. And actually, even the lower quality but cheaper and easier to produce cast tracks were not available in sufficient amounts. There's an episode in my book where I mentioned that production of tanks is so limited by production of track links that after tanks complete the QA process, they have to donate their track links to another tank so that tank could do its QA driving around. And so the cost of the production was definitely very very important. I do mention another issue with the factory had with subcontractors, where due to the subcontractors bickering with one another, the cost of the tank was absurd amount, much higher, like 2.5 times the cost of a BT-7 tank, much higher than the cost of the tank was estimated, and so significant efforts had to be undertaken to not even reduce the value sort of the tank's components, but just to get the individual factories to not charge an arm and a leg to one another. So as you can see, the USSR's economy was a little bit more capitalist than you would expect it to be. Did the Soviets make special provision for the extremes of the USSR's climate in designing the T-34? Was crew comfort a consideration? They definitely did. So the T-34 was tested in a very diverse climates. It was tested in prairies, or rather steppes. It was tested in sand. It was tested in very high temperatures, hot weather. It was tested in the cold. So the famous drive from Moscow to or from Kharkov to Moscow and back, that was done in it was done in March and April, but it was still very cold. There was a lot of snow. There were wide-scale trials held in November, December of 1940. This kind of mass production tanks. All of this was indeed to figure out how well the tank worked in very harsh climates. In terms of crew comfort, this is another myth that's very widespread about Soviet tank design, is that the Soviet tank designers didn't care about comfort. The army didn't care about comfort. You were told to sit in your tank, you go sit in your tank, you don't complain. Crew comfort was actually a very big issue, and a lot of attention was directed to solving issues with crew placement in tanks. Unfortunately, crew comfort butted up against other aspects of the design. So, for example, the T-34 had a turret ring that was 1420 millimeters wide. So just enough for two average adults to kind of squeeze in there with the gun in between them. Now, this was not particularly roomy, and one of the earliest complaints about even in the A-34 was that the turret needs to be made wider. However, the two things that could not be compromised to make the turret wider is you could not change the slope of the sides. So the protection had to remain the same, and you could not change the diameter of the turret ring. Since changing the diameter of the turret ring means you have to redesign the hull, you have to make the hull wider to accommodate this larger turret ring, and that would essentially put you to, if not to square one, then it would be quite a huge setback in terms of the design process. So these requirements to make the turret bigger butted up against these other requirements to produce a lot of these tanks. And so there was, I guess, a compromise. The turret was widened by 160 millimeters without widening the turret ring. So that gave the crew's upper bodies a little bit more space to move around. Unfortunately, their torsos were still constricted by this narrow turret ring. The T-34M, the replacement of the T-34, was supposed to have a wider turret ring, but unfortunately it was never put into production. There were also provisions in place to make the driver's life easier. There were hydraulic servos put in place to make the tank easier to steer. Those were found to be very effective, but again, very complicated, very expensive. These were actually replaced with mechanical servos later, which were also found to be effective at making the tank easier to steer. How long was the T-34 expected to remain in service when it was designed? Do you think the designers had any idea of how successful their tank would be, or do you think they assumed it was just another step towards bigger and better vehicles? So initial production plans of the T-34, they did envision this tank as the Red Army's main tank. It would replace both the BT series of tanks and the T-26. However, these plans would go on for a very long time. Full production would not finish until earliest estimates, late 1942, early 1943. And so this tank was supposed to stay in production for quite some time. However, development of a replacement began in early 1941. This was quite a normal situation for Soviet armored forces. For example, the replacements for the BT-2, as I mentioned in a previous video, were put out just the next year. So BT-2 entered production in 1932. It was removed from production in 1933. BT-5, same thing, 1933 to 1944. Replacements for the T-26, the T-46 development began in 1933, so the same year the tank with a single turret went into production. This was quite a normal thing for Soviet tank industry to do, and so there was no way to tell in the spring of 1941 if the T-34 would go on to have a very long and successful service career, or if it would be removed from production in August of 1941 to be replaced by the T-34M. How far did the T-34's designers think about future developments when putting together the earliest versions? Were they thinking early on about bigger guns, thicker armor, and bigger engines? So the T-34 that you know is actually the improved and modernized version. So the A-32, as it was originally envisioned, its armor was not 45 millimeters thick. It was about 20 to 30 millimeters thick. It was only designed to withstand high caliber machine guns rather than cannon shells. It was also armed with a short barreled L10 gun, L10 76 millimeter gun. There was a variant of it that was armed with a 45 millimeter gun. So then, the A-34 that it was equipped with thicker armor and a longer L11 gun. The T-34 that was going to go into production would have same armor, improved protection due to the configuration. It was supposed to have the F-32 gun. That never actually happened. The L-11 was replaced directly with the F-34 in March of 1941. And if you consider the 57 millimeter high velocity ZIS-4 gun, then that's another gun upgrade that the T-34 received. That being said, the T-34M was supposed to have a 600 horsepower engine. It would be the same engine used in the KV. It was essentially the same V2, just with a supercharger, so it would still fit in the same engine compartment. There were also a number of upgrades that were designed for the T-34M that were never implemented on the tank because it never entered production, that migrated onto the T-34. So as you can see, the tank was actually pretty thoroughly modernized even in 1941, let alone the subsequent years. It's often been said that the greatest shortcoming of the early T-34s was a lack of effective communication between crews. Was the T-34 designed with communication between tanks and between different units in mind? So the answer to that is yes. The T-34 was designed to use a radio. There was, however, an issue with that. Traditionally, Soviet tanks had a radio in the turret bustle. In this case, the commander would be servicing it, but since there was a fourth crew member, the radio operator slash hull gunner, it was preferably that he would actually, the radio operator would actually operate the radio. However, it was not quite as easy to put the radio in the hull gunner's station. So there was a number of trials that were held to figure out what the best configuration is. Meanwhile, T-34 tanks actually went into production with radios in the turret bustle. And if you look at early T-34, T-34 tanks in German photos, these tanks that are knocked out, you could actually see that some of them have the little cylinder for the radio antenna on the turret rather than the hull. So these were the pre-production, or not pre-production tanks, the pilot tanks with the older style radio arrangements. So as you can see, even though the radio arrangements were not quite satisfactory, the tank was still produced with this radio rather than no kind of radio. This is another myth that was popular, and I guess still is, claiming that Soviet tanks had no radios. If you look at the absolute number of Soviet tanks that were produced with radios, it is actually greater than the absolute number of tanks produced with radios in other countries. It's when you get to the percentage numbers, about 50% of BT tanks, T-26 tanks, tanks that were supposed to be built in large numbers, about half of those were built with radios. For lack of a better term, premium tanks like the KV, the T-35, the T-28, every single one of these tanks was built with a radio. The problem was that Soviet tank production eclipsed electronics production, so it was simply not possible to produce enough radios to put on every tank until about 1943, and well, wisely, the Red Army decided they would rather have a tank without a radio than have no tank at all. World of Tanks has recently introduced a line of Soviet tanks with double main guns. Is this based on reality? And if so, was such an arrangement ever considered for the T-34? Yes, so this is based on real tanks. Now, a lot of these are post-war tanks and weird obscure prototypes I've never seen before, but there were tanks with dual guns or dual cannons rather than just dual machine guns that were, or coaxial machine guns that were produced and even destined for mass production. Most famously, I'd say the KV-1, the first KV-1 prototype, had a 45mm coaxial gun in addition to its 76mm gun. It never went into combat like that. That gun was replaced by a DT machine gun. But the idea of having a coaxial 45mm gun never died. And you had KV-4 tanks with a main 107mm gun. Some of these tanks had 45mm gun turrets either on top of the turret, in front of the turret. There's quite a variety of KV-4 designs, but some of them had them as a coaxial gun. In terms of the T-34, there was a very interesting project. So in late 1941, Stalin personally came up with what he called an assault tank. So this tank, rather than having one big gun, had three guns that would fire in a burst. So the KV-7 is probably the most famous example of that. It had the 176mm gun in the center and kind of the two 45s flanking it. Later you see a version with just two 76mm guns. This idea proved ludicrous. The tank was never mass produced, but the concept came in handy when developing the Su-152. There was a version of the T-34 as well developed with a similar armament. It was never built, but if you look at the blueprints, you'll see why. It had the same, so this is so many guns that even the KV's larger turret couldn't fit all of them. They had to move to a casemate. All these guns would be set in a rotating turret. I heard that the turret couldn't rotate the full 360 degrees for fear of injuring the loader, but honestly I have no idea how any crewmen could even be in this turret at all. And of course this tank was never built. It was quite ridiculous. But yes, as you can see, this idea from World of Tanks is in fact based on real designs. If you were designing the T-34, knowing what you know today, would you have changed design in any way? If so, how would you have changed it? Was there anything obvious that, with hindsight, designers got wrong? So there's a very popular genre of historical fiction in Russia. It's called Popadanцы. Essentially, it's about a person who travels back in time through some method, and with knowledge that he has from modern history, he can change the timeline somehow. World War II is, of course, a very popular time for these people to go back to, and usually they have some brilliant idea like, hey, let's build AKs, let's build RPGs, which makes everything better instantly. The problem with these people going back is illustrated by Russian historian Alexei Isayev. He talks about one of these examples. So someone going back and saying, let's build RPGs. The problem was that Soviet scientists and Soviet engineers knew about RPGs, or rather, hollow charge ammunition. What they didn't know was what's the composition of the gunpowder, what's the optimal size and of the cone, how do you stabilize the projectile in flight, various very technical things like that. And additionally, the military's requirements were to have RPG warheads that have identical effectiveness to an anti-tank rifle, meaning that you could hit a tank-sized target at about a kilometer away. As you probably know, the highest range attained by any kind of anti-tank heat projectile in World War II was about 100 yards. So even the very concept of hitting something that far out with an RPG with World War II technology was impossible. So I would have to go back in time with not only extremely technical knowledge, but also somehow be able to convince the military that what I'm bringing back is actually correct. Going back in time before the T-34 was put into production would actually land me in a very turbulent time. 1936, 37, 38, that's when the purges were really starting up. So if, somebody was popping up with all of these weird ideas, that would be a pretty good way to get arrested, especially considering that even Koshkin himself, the designer of the T-34, he was reported for sabotage. There was an investigation. He was found innocent, obviously, but it's quite a suspicious time. Now, if you absolutely ignore all of these restrictions, I would say that I would end up producing something like the T-44. So, a perpendicular engine, turret brought back, turret ring widened to kind of the full width of the tank. Forget the sloped sides. Focus on probably tighter infantry communication and cooperation in order to protect the tank from anti-tank guns from a hit from the side, and use the extra weight to beef up the front, make it a monolithic front without openings for machine gun ports and the driver's hatch like in the T-44. Unfortunately, a lot of the things that I just said to get rid of were requirements that the Army really wanted. So, unfortunately, there is probably no way to build a T-44 in 1940 or 1941 as much as we'd like to. Alright, that was it. Those are all the questions that were submitted. If you'd like to learn more about the T-34's design process, you can, of course, buy this book. It is available both as a paper copy and as an ebook. There are links in the description below. If you would like to send me some questions to answer in a future video, please email them to tankarchives@gmail.com.